Can we go to Matthew 19? Because that's the big one. And I love how you raise chapter 4 of the book where you ask the question, is sexual infidelity the only grounds for divorce? First of all, would you say that is the most common, popular, mainstream view? Or I know there's various views in this passage, but is that kind of like the default position, that anything other than sexual infidelity is not biblical grounds for divorce?
I would say 100%, Preston. I would say that by and far that divorce as a possibility is widely accepted, right? We can start there. Like divorce is I think there was a time where it'd be like, no reason at all. I think we've well moved beyond that.
Yeah, John Piper held that.
Right. But then we get to like Matthew 19. So then it's like the next step is like, well, then the only case for a divorce is in the question of adultery. And that obviously is pulled from Matthew 19. And Matthew 19 is somewhat more of a complex passage.
So Matthew 19, yes, he says, except for sexual immorality, porneia, I think it is, right? The Greek word.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to be like this is the one exception, but you do a great job unpacking this verse. So can you help us understand?
What I'm trying to show is that today we do this. We don't even think about it, that there's a culture. And the same thing is true in the time of Jesus in Matthew 19. And the Pharisees approach him. It's large crowds are following him. Verse 3, some Pharisees approached him to test him. They asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And look at how they tried to set the trap on any grounds. Right? So around the time of Jesus, there are these two primary schools of thought that have kind of come about, the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And so the school of Shammai, we could just summarize it this way, that they believe that you could have a valid divorce as a matter of indecency that is found. So that indecency, however, would have had to have been connected to sexual infidelity, to adultery. Now, the school of Hillel, they were much more liberal. Like we could think about this in terms of conservative and liberal almost, of schools of thought. And so in their kind of liberal, more understanding, they're like any matter, that phrase is actually like for any reason. And so in the Mishnah, there's even a story of an individual, a woman who spoils her dish, like basically burns her food. It's like, there you go. you can divorce your wife for any matter. I found the reason, right? And so instantly they're trying to set a trap. And then I this is where I'm saying Jesus is a little passive aggressive and he's hilarious. I think Jesus is a great hang. Verse 4, haven't you read? I mean, he's saying this to the Pharisees who are supposed to be the most well-read people. It's like, hey, by the way, haven't you read? And then it's really interesting that the next kind of diatribe that Jesus goes into is, you think that he might be trying to shift away from the conversation, but what he's actually doing is, a husband could be guilty of adultery only if he was sleeping with a married woman, another married woman. But if he slept with an unmarried woman, technically he would not be guilty of adultery. He would be guilty of fornication, but not adultery. So in a patriarchal society, in this scenario, Jesus does a little sidestep, and what he does is he actually brings up and elevates the men to a level of responsibility that's like, by the way, you both have responsibility, both men and women, to the unity, to the origin story of what God always intended for marriage. And then verse 7, why then, he asked them, so the Pharisees, did Moses command, notice the language there, command us to give divorce papers and send her away. So this is the Pharisees putting their kind of interpretive lens on and translating the Hebrew Bible. And so Jesus responds in verse 8. He told them, well, actually Moses permits you. So it's not a command, it's a permittance, right? And so what the Pharisees are doing is they're actually quoting from Deuteronomy 24:1, and the Hebrew grammar there is neutral. So it could be he should or he may. And the Pharisees go with a concrete command that he must. But Jesus actually clarifies this, and then he interprets it through the lens of the gospel. And now he's saying, actually, he may, or it is allowed, but it's not necessarily demanded. And then Jesus goes on to say, well, the allowance of the divorce is based on a hardness of heart. A hardness of heart. Another very important word, because this word is connected to the Septuagint of Jeremiah 4:4, which refers to a kind of stubbornness. A kind of stubbornness. So this means that Jesus actually leaves room for divorce in the case of the offender who's showing a hardness of heart through persistent, stubborn unrepentance. And so this is where we would want to kind of clarify, we're not talking about like these one-off scenarios, like I just made a mistake. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that is unrepentant and unbecoming of the people of God. And what Jesus is ultimately saying is that this Hillel understanding of like, for any reason, you can just find a way out, that's actually inconsistent with the way of God. And then divorce in the context of adultery, this is what he says, based off of sexual immorality, is permissible, while there's also room for repentance and we should seek after it. But if it becomes necessary, it's necessary. Now, this is where I would just say, remember that the people of the time are filling in conceptual understandings of words and phrases. In the same way, when I said to Lisa, how are the Jags doing? She filled in the gap. Football, they played in London at that time. They had to try, like, there's all this stuff that's filling in. So I'm actually pulling from Dr. Instone Brewer, who's an Old Testament scholar, probably the best scholar in terms of understanding ancient certificates of divorce, and also kind of the grammar. And Instone Brewer brings up this really important point where conceptually at the time, when Jesus says sexual immorality, the people of the time are filling in conceptually in their mind. And of course he means, Exodus 21, emotional neglect or material neglect or physical neglect. And so what we see as restrictive at that time would have been less about restrictive, but highlighting that one word, just like we would say the Jags, to trigger a series of other things that would have filled in the gap. And so I would just suggest that it could be interpreted that way. I would make the argument in that time that would have not been the instant way to interpret it as exclusivity.
Just to clarify, so when he says except for sexual immorality, he's not saying that this is the only exception. He's just triggering one among other grounds for divorce, rooted in like Exodus 21. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason why I think that's a valid understanding is because notice this entire conversation is already based on these two schools of thought. We're already dealing with the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. We're already dealing with what is permissible and what's not permissible. And Jesus is reframing the conversation, and he doesn't need to give every detail, right? And we're not, we don't see the recording of that, and yet we're trying to just figure out, like, how would that original hearer have heard this? And so that's where I would say, well, yeah, they would have filled in the blanks of saying there are these categories that divorce would have been permissible.